In the year 1519, Montezuma II found himself the ruler of one of the greatest civilizations that had ever existed. The Aztec Empire stretched across much of modern day Mexico, and it had an estimated population of as much as 6 million people, which is a huge number by the standards of the day. Montezuma must have thought of himself to some extent as king of the world. Now, the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica, they were big into calendar keeping. They would mark out important events like prophecies about the future or anniversaries way ahead of time in their calendars. It's why we had all that strangeness in 2012 when people thought that the world was going to end because of the Mayan calendar, either by way of some great natural disaster or an even funnier theory that the Earth was about to collide with a mysterious planet called Nibiru. It's not the first time we've talked about the end of the world on my podcast. I don't know why I seem so fascinated with the topic of eschatology, but then again, maybe we all are to an extent. After all of these ancient faiths, they have some sort of version of the apocalypse written out, and I think it might be the same part of human nature that makes us want to watch stuff like true crime documentaries, learning about the scary mind of a serial killer. To some extent, I guess eschatology is like the ultimate expression of disaster porn. Now, a large part of modern day Mexico City, next to the Sierra de Guadalupe, used to be covered in a freshwater lake, and on an island in the middle of the lake sat the crown jewel of the Aztec Empire, their imperial capital, the impossible city of Tenochtitlan. Now, some scholars have said that the Aztecs' tendency to believe in prophecy could have been one of the things that led to their ultimate downfall, because when, on a day in the early 1500s, a small army of strangely clad men simply walked into the temple district of Tenochtitlan, Montezuma and his court seemed to have believed that they were heralds of the great serpentine storm god Quetzalcoatl. Now, this is one of my favorite deities of the ancient world. He's essentially a giant epic storm dragon, but he also takes a human form, and he was prophesied to return to the Aztec people. The reason he was gone in the first place is a little bit of an unfortunate story, because one day, when in his human form, he drank too much and started acting like an asshole. And he may or may not have had sex with a celibate priestess who may or may not have been his own sister. So when he woke up hungover the next day, he felt very bad, as you would. And he placed himself in a stone coffin and set himself on fire. And as his heart burned and turned into smoke, it ascended into the heavens and became the morning star. Quetzalcoatl also lends his name, by the way, to one of the most amazing animals that ever lived on the face of the earth. Like, easily one of the coolest creatures in our entire fossil record. The Quetzalcoatlus was an Azdarchid. It's a kind of flighted reptile that doesn't really exist anymore, but they were very prolific during the Cretaceous, and this was probably the largest animal that ever flew the skies of the earth. A creature larger than a modern-day giraffe. It had a wingspan of 11 to 12 meters, or upwards of 40 feet, easily large enough that it could swoop out of the sky and gulp down prey the size of you or I without even chewing. I think we're probably quite fortunate with the animals we happen to share this planet with at the time. I know a lot of people are scared to go in the ocean because of the existence of great white sharks and a few other species of large predatory fish that might try to have a nibble. On land, there are, I guess, a couple of different species of animal that will actively hunt humans. A couple of large cats. In terms of reptiles, there are Komodo dragons and some of the larger crocodilians who will actively hunt for human flesh. couple of canids, I guess, if they group up on us, but we at least don't have to worry about anything large enough flying in our skies that it can just swoop down and eat us when we're on our way to school. I bet the Aztecs wish they would have known that the man that they had just let into their midst was none other than Hernan Cortes, a Spanish soldier and madman who led his men across the sea from Spanish Cuba, illegally and without authority, by the way, and landed in the Yucatan with the express intention of conquering the Aztec Empire for the Spanish crown, but probably more for his own personal glory. Just to give you an idea of what kind of a man we're dealing with Cortes, once he landed in Mexico, he destroyed all the ships they came on because he didn't want his men to believe that there was any option of going back. As far as he was concerned, there was only one way for them, and it was forwards to glory and conquest. I've often wondered if Tolkien, when he wrote his books, knew about this story and let it inspire him. You're not to know this, but I'm a huge Lord of the Rings nerd, and there's this story about this asshole elf called Feanor who leads his people across the sea from Aman to Middle-earth. He also does it illegally on stolen ships, by the way, and when he reaches the foreign shore, he also burns the ships. Problem being that he left many of his people who are exiled on the other side, and they have no option but to walk to Middle-earth on this frozen ice bridge in the north, which I think is called the Helcarax. And one of the ancient elves who makes that journey on foot is Galadriel, the beautiful blonde elf who is portrayed by Cate Blanchett in the movies. This is a complete digression. But the Spaniards take Montezuma hostage and essentially lay siege to Tenochtitlan from the temple district in its very center. The city is in open rebellion and many battles are fought, but by the end of this entire drama, the Aztec Empire falls to the Spanish conquistadors. Very sad story, but much of the beautiful culture of the Aztecs is preserved, not to mention their amazing language. There were many scholars and linguists who traveled with the conquistadors, and they wrote books like the Arte de la Lengua Mexicana, where you can learn about the language that they spoke. One word that I know that you know that survives in modern day English is the word chocolatl, which is a name for a bitter drink that the Aztecs used to make from beans that they grew. And once the Europeans added sugar to that, it became what we know today as chocolate. This is not an episode on Mesoamerican history, by the way. I'm only telling this entire story because I'm trying to get to a very specific point in it. Because when Cortez's men enter the temple district of Tenochtitlan, some of them reported seeing something really quite amazing and terrifying. Pyramids made from human skulls and giant effigies of bone that were so massive that they must have been harvested from people, numbering in the thousands. Many historians have said that these numbers must have been exaggerated by the Spaniards in an attempt to demonize their enemy and justify their unjust war on the Aztecs, but it's only recently that archaeological finds have been made in Mexico that not only support these stories, but actually make some of them seem quite understated. And to understand and unpack this, we need to get what I want to be the actual subject of this little episode, which is the metaphysical concept of sacrifice. It is very cold outside right now. I am recording this episode in a big fluffy hoodie thing that I found in a store yesterday, and I'm wearing big fluffy slippers that I brought to Japan from my native Sweden. I know that during this dark and cold time, at least in the northern hemisphere, a lot of important religious holidays are being celebrated all across the world, probably most prolifically a certain Christian one. But I promised myself that I wasn't going to mention the name of that holiday in this episode, and I don't want it to be an episode themed around that holiday, because even though I grew up celebrating it with my own family, and I know that this is an important and beautiful time to a lot of people, I also know that it's the time of year when a lot of people feel the most estranged and the most melancholic. It can be a very sad and heavy time for a lot of people, and I've definitely been there myself. I'm essentially celebrating alone this year. My own family is on the opposite side of the planet at the moment, and so if you're like that and this is a difficult time for you, then this episode is made specifically for you. Let's see if I can't tell a couple of stories and help you kill an hour of darkness. But this certain Christian holiday is at least what gave me the idea that eventually turned into the theme of this episode, because it celebrates the birth of the Nazarene carpenter, the God King of mankind, who eventually sacrificed himself and sort of ascended to becoming this metaphysical gateway through which Christian souls pass into paradise. It's a pretty cool story when you think about it that way, and it gave me this idea of thinking about the word sacrifice and the different ways you can sort of twist and turn that. But let's for the moment return to the Aztec Empire and finish our story about it. The Aztecs eventually became famous for their practice of ritual human sacrifice. It's usually depicted as the very dramatic act of cutting open the chest cavity of a living human being and offering the still beating heart to the sky. Just to give you an indication of how far they took this practice, I want to give you a number, and it's a number that when I read it for the first time, I had to stop and breathe and think, because it is completely mind-boggling. But there are legitimate historical documents that indicate that when the Templo Mayor, the sort of main temple of Tenochtitlan, was inaugurated, the event was celebrated in quotation marks with the ritual sacrifice of as many as 80,000 men, women, and children. I mean, just think about the logistics of something like that. How long does it take you to kill 80,000 people? Do the priests work in shifts? Do their tools get worn out along the way and need to be changed? How many gallons, how many hundreds of gallons of blood are being spilled, and where does it all go? I mean, you're on an island in a lake in Mexico. What about bugs? What about other scavenging animals? I mean, it's a completely insane story to think about. And as you would imagine, there were some very profound cultural and spiritual reasons why the Aztecs would do this. And to explain that, we need to introduce another god. His name is Huitzilopochtli, and he's the sort of main god of the original ethnic tribe of Mexico, the native Mexicans, and the main god of the Aztec Empire. When they conquered neighboring tribes, they would allow them to keep their original religions as long as they entered Huitzilopochtli into them. And he was a warrior god of the sun and the light. The Aztecs believed he fought a constant war against the darkness in the sky. And I think it was derived from the cycles of day and night. Every morning the sun comes up and conquers the darkness, but eventually night comes back and the light goes away. The Aztecs seem to believe that there was a very real possibility that the sun would lose that battle, which would plunge the earth into an age of eternal night and darkness. So yes, I'm sorry, but we're already back to stories about the apocalypse. But the Aztecs also seem to believe that the life energy inside of human beings were derived from the gods, and so by offering them back to them, we could sustain the gods in their fight against darkness and evil. One of the perks of becoming a sacrifice was that you would essentially be elevated to a holy, immortal warrior of the light, and you would end up fighting in the army of Huitzilopochtli against the darkness forever. So it was a profound, profound honor for these people. I guess the Aztecs had a point, because as endothermic creatures on this earth, the sort of heat energy inside of our bodies is just many times converted solar energy. And if you are a reptile, then you're just basking in solar energy directly and taking it into your body to sustain yourself. So even though it is a very dark and gruesome story in a lot of ways, I can actually really admire this one belief of the Aztecs, that the very rotations of the entire universe is sort of deeply connected to the essential life energy locked away inside of a human heart. Let's do an advertisement before we keep talking. This episode of the Frame Whispers podcast is brought to you by the monster underneath your bed. Could you please stop moving so fast when you get up in the middle of the night? It's making it very hard to grab your ankles. How am I supposed to do my job if you won't even give me a chance? Have some bloody respect. Thank you. I once met this girl in Nagasaki who started telling me a really disturbing ghost story about a haunted hospital that would always appear in her dreams while I was eating her ass. And what really threw me off about that is, if I were doing my job properly, she should have been too distracted to weave this really involved narrative. But that obviously wasn't the case, and it was actually quite rude. But I was thinking about her the other day and thinking about going back to Nagasaki, and I got lost in thought, and it turned into this second segment of the podcast. The Manhattan Project refers to an engineering endeavor undertaken in the 1940s by some 130,000 people across more than 30 locations in the US, Canada, and the UK, with the goal of developing the first ever atomic weapon. When I was still a student, I lived for a spring in the northern city of Sapporo here in Japan, and I was mainly fucking around and partying at the time, but one day me and my fellow exchange students were called into the auditorium of the university we were at, and we were told this really inspirational story, and I want to retell it as well as I can here. I'm just going to say out of respect that it's been over a decade, and I might be fuzzy on some of the details, but it was the story of this postman, a true story of a man who lived in Nagasaki in the 1940s. And if you've ever been to the city, it's a beautiful place surrounded by really tall mountains. And one day he's delivering mail in the hills when all of a sudden the atomic bomb is detonated in the city, and he turns around to see essentially his entire world destroyed in the blink of an eye. He rushes back into the city to look for his family, and he goes to his grandfather's bookstore. Now, his family isn't around anymore, but when he goes into the basement, some of the books are still burning, and he describes the flame as being very strange, sort of demonic looking, and for some reason, he picks up a lantern and lights it using this fire. And then he retreats into the mountains, moves into a small village, and starts growing old. Apparently the children and the people in the town used to talk about this guy because he always kept a fire burning in his house, even at night. Many years later, somebody is passing through town and happens to talk to this guy and realizes that he has kept the flame in this lantern burning for decades, and it's still the same flame essentially that he lit using the fire from the atomic explosion. So this person realizes that this has profound historical significance for the Japanese people, and from that the story sort of exploded. Now, the year I was in Sapporo, they had this project they were doing where they had lit another lantern using that flame in the deep south of Japan, and they were going to carry it all the way north to Sapporo without ever getting on any kind of transportation, just passing it from person to person, the Japanese people carrying this flame all through the country. And we're listening to this really profound story, and me and my friends are very hungover, and I just remember thinking, man, I hope nobody barfs in the middle of this because it's going to be so disrespectful. But then all of a sudden they just dim the lights and go, ladies and gentlemen, here it is. And somebody just walks in the room carrying this lantern with a flame that has essentially been burning since the atomic explosion destroyed Nagasaki, and it blew me away. I mean, I know it's not the same fire, it's a chemical reaction with the oxygen and the fuel and everything else, but just symbolically it was this really profound moment for me, and they just came up to me and handed it to me, and I held it in my hands, and it was, a pretty awesome moment. The principal weapons development of the Manhattan Project took place at Los Alamos laboratories, which were directed at the time by a man named Robert Oppenheimer. The whole Manhattan Project was overseen by a U.S. Army general, but Oppenheimer was sort of the guy on the ground in charge who understood everything that was going on. Him and a bunch of other very famous scientists witnessed the first ever successful test of a nuclear weapon in 1945. It's the event that became known as the Trinity test. Recalling the Trinity test in an interview, Oppenheimer spoke some words that have since become very, very famous. He says that witnessing this insane release of power, a quote from one of the most beloved books in all of Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, just popped into his head. Now, this is my personal favorite book of scripture that I've ever read. I've read it twice in my life now, once when I was younger and then one more time in preparation for making this episode. But the quote that Oppenheimer recalled was this: "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." And it's easy to think that what he meant by that is he's seeing the explosion and realizing that he's about to unleash a power on humanity that will forever change the course of human history. And maybe he's experiencing a measure of apprehension or regret about that. But if you read what people have to say about Oppenheimer in these days, it doesn't seem to be quite the whole truth. People talk about him walking around with a spring in his step and seeming very satisfied. Oppenheimer probably saw the Manhattan Project as something extremely important that had been placed under his responsibility, and he had seen it to success and was satisfied with that. But if that is the case, what does he mean by those words from the Bhagavad Gita? Well, to attempt to answer that a little bit, we have to tell some of the story of the Bhagavad Gita, and in order to be able to do that, we need to travel back many thousands of years in time to an ancient battlefield in India and a place called Kurukshetra. At Kurukshetra, a great battle is about to take place between two rival groups of cousins who both have claims to the throne of the kingdom. Our good guys in the story, but as we're about to learn, it's never quite that simple, are the Pandava, a small group of good men who have the legitimate claim to the throne and have been pushed to the brink of desperation by their opponents. Now, one of them, the young warrior prince Arjuna, really has his doubts about engaging in all of this violence, but before the battle, he goes to his Lord Krishna to ask for aid. And you've probably heard the name Krishna. He's sort of thought of being this god of hippies who kind of shows up and teaches people about sex, but in these ancient books he is a lot more. He is essentially the essence of all of creation in the shape of a man, infinite and perfect wisdom made flesh. So if you're going to go to somebody for advice, he's pretty much the guy to go to. But the thing is, one of Arjuna's opponents also goes to Krishna for aid. And even though, like I said, Krishna is sort of the god of everything, if we're to make him the god of something specific, he's probably the god of love and compassion for everything and everyone. And so he's not going to play favorites in this battle. If both of them ask him for help, then he's going to help both of them. And Krishna decrees this: one of you is going to have the benefit of my divine army. That army that fights under my command is going to be on your side in the battle. But the side that doesn't get my army is going to get to have me as their personal advisor. And you can see where this is going. Obviously, the, in quotation marks, bad guys get the divine army, but Arjuna ends up with Krishna at his side as his personal advisor. And everybody squares up to fight. The captains on both sides of the battle are blowing their battle horns, and Krishna and Arjuna are riding in their chariot and overlooking the battlefield. And Arjuna sees that on the opposing side are many men who he loves and respects, members of his family, his teachers, his uncles, people who he has known since he was a small child. And he realizes that if this battle takes place, many people who he loves will have to die, and he grows very lethargic. He basically says to Krishna, wouldn't it be better if I just gave up? If I just give up and let them kill me, then yes, I will die and we will lose, but all of these good men will get to walk out of here with their lives. Now, hearing this, Krishna disagrees, and Krishna's reply to that one question essentially becomes the entire book of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna sort of struggles for a while to convince Arjuna to do his duty as a warrior and engage in this battle. Arjuna says, "But don't you see, all these men will die and I have the power to save them." And hearing that, Krishna decides that it's time to stop playing Mr. Nice God, and he reveals to Arjuna his true and final form. This man who is standing next to Arjuna, and they're good friends by the way, he instantly transforms into a gigantic and infinitely horrific monster. And as Arjuna looks up at Krishna, he can see that in his mouth he is already chewing on every single man on the battlefield and essentially on everything else in creation. And Krishna speaks these words. He says, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." And I think what he means, and I know this is super stupid and pretentious, me trying to break down one of the most profound moments in all of Holy Scripture, but I think the way I interpret it is, Krishna is revealing himself to be the essence of entropy in the universe. He's saying that everything that lives eventually dies. Everything that has structure eventually crumbles. Don't kid yourself into believing that these men will escape death just because they survive this one battle. You're all mine in the end, and time isn't even linear, by the way. Depending on where you are and what you're doing in the universe, these men aren't even born yet, or maybe they've been dead for millennia. There is nothing you can do to escape the inevitability of death, but right now you are a holy warrior on a battlefield fighting for a righteous cause, and that has meaning. That is what you need to do regardless of what the outcome might be. And this is where I want to wrap back around to Robert Oppenheimer, because I think the reason he remembered this moment and the thing that he and Arjuna had in common is that they were both mortal men who suddenly came into contact with cosmic level power, with levels of energy that just escape the comprehension of the human mind. So as far as I can understand, it's not really a question of Oppenheimer being apprehensive about violence the way Arjuna was apprehensive about violence. It's more a question of having your mind super fucking blown by the awesomeness of the universe. But this is also where I want to get back to my sort of theme for this episode, which is the idea of sacrifice, because if you read the entire book, Krishna goes on to explain what he means when he says that you should do what you have to do in the real world for the sake of doing it and not because you're expecting certain results. And this ties into his explanation of the ancient concept of yoga. In the modern world, yoga is an apparently very beneficial form of exercise where you put on very sexy pants and you go to a studio and you do a lot of stretching. But in the old books, the meaning of it is very broad. It's essentially any kind of spiritual practice. But the point is that you do what you're doing as well as you can for the sake of doing it. And any result, anything that comes as a consequence of your actions, is what you yield as a sacrifice to the divine, to the universe. And I think there is a profound lesson to be learned for us in the modern world, because so often I find myself just doing things because I want some certain level of feedback, and I see it in people all around me. We want more money or we want gratitude. We're just looking for the next level and the next shit. We're chasing a horizon that is as far away no matter how close to it we get. And so I try and remember this these days when I'm playing an online video game and I'm not seeing the results that I would like, or I'm having a really difficult day at work. I try and think about, okay, for now, I'm just going to do what it is I can do as well as I can. And no matter what happens as a consequence, I'm just going to yield to the universe, even if the outcome is very good. I'm not going to let it flow into pride, and me being satisfied. I'm just going to be as here and as now as I can right now. And obviously, if you manage to do that perfectly, then I guess you get to become an enlightened being and you get to be as the Buddha. But there is at least something very profound in there, and it's one of the reasons I really love this book, and it's the lesson that I try to take with me after having read it. I always give a film recommendation in each of these episodes, and I want to do it in this one as well, because we have a bit of a film club thing going. But When I think about sacrifice in cinema, the only thing that pops into my head is, well, Gandalf and Boromir, because I'm such a massive Lord of the Rings fan, but I want to recommend something that you are slightly less likely to have already seen. So I thought about it a lot, and I came up with two films that I really want to recommend for this episode. The first one is the first ever Silent Hill film, and I know a lot of people are careful about adaptations of video games because, first of all, they tend not to be faithful at all to the source material, but they also tend not to be very good movies. But the first Silent Hill film is really quite great, and it's just a great horror movie, so if you haven't played the video games, then I definitely still recommend it, provided that you have the stomach for something that is really quite violent and really quite dark. If you don't like that sort of thing, then maybe don't watch it alone. But to give you a brief introduction to the story without spoiling anything, this couple have a child. Oh, and I guess Boromir is in it because the dad is played by Sean Bean, but the mother is the main character. And their daughter is having traumatic visions of this place called Silent Hill. So to help her, the mother takes her there, and they get trapped in the dark dimension of that town. And to escape, they have to try and figure out how their family is connected to that place and sort of uncover its mysteries. The effects are really quite amazing. My favorite one is the scene with the nurses, and if you've seen it or you play the games, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. But the way they did it apparently is they recorded people walking backwards, but then they played that footage backwards, and it creates this really unnatural and creepy effect that is just perfect. So it's a great little horror film, and I really recommend it to everybody. But the other movie that I want to recommend, and this is one of my favorite films of all time, it might be number one, but it places easily in the top three. It's Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven. And if you haven't seen it, it's kind of like Ridley Scott's Gladiator, but you subtract a lot of the sort of cinematic elements, but you inject a lot more subtext. I'm not going to talk about the story a whole lot because it's really not the point of the movie, but it takes place in Jerusalem during the Crusades, and it touches upon like a lot of the themes that I talked about in this episode. It stars Orlando Bloom. Oh, so I guess we have Legolas as well. Maybe I'm just obsessed with Lord of the Rings, but I think it's his best work in a very subdued role. But this is a movie that really takes its time. It drags and is really quite long, but it has a lot to say, and I really love that about it. So if you're into that, then definitely check it out, but maybe don't watch it with a date. When you have an evening to kill and you're looking for something to chew on, maybe check it out. But it is a really great piece of cinema, in my opinion. I have this very dear friend here in Japan, a man who I've known for many years now, probably my best friend and the person I'm going to end up spending New Year's Eve together with. But he's an American guy whose conversation I really enjoy. He teaches me things about the English language and about arcane-sounding places like Iowa and Delaware and the sunken city of Atlanta, Georgia. But a couple of years ago, he just handed me a book and said, I think you'd really enjoy this. I read it, and it ended up being one of my favorite novels of all time. And that made me really respect my friendship to this person. When somebody says, I think you'd like this, and then it impacts you in a big way and changes the way you think about love and relationships, it's a really nice feeling because it's like they really know you, and that's a great feeling for some reason, when you feel understood. But I was thinking about that book, and I realized that it touches on a lot of the things I wanted to talk about in the podcast. I'm going to talk about it now, but it's called The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And I think it would be equally well titled The Unbearable Weight of Devotion. But it's essentially a love story. Thomas is a very attractive and successful bachelor. Teresa is a heavily traumatized and careful waitress, and they fall deeply in love. But Thomas realizes that he cannot give up. He cannot sacrifice his life of casual sex with random women for Teresa, even though he desperately needs her because she's the only thing that anchors him to the real world, the only thing that gives him a semblance of purpose. Teresa, at the same time, she sort of takes shelter from her trauma and her horrible mother in the care of Thomas, and she wants to tie him down to her, but at the same time, she's looking to break out of the relationship and explore her own individuality. She wants to learn how to express herself creatively, and it's this beautiful illustration, I think, of the very annoying mechanism that seems to be built into the human heart, where the grass is always greener on the other side. In order for your relationship with somebody to mean something, you need to devote yourself to them. You need to take on responsibility. But as soon as you start to build that castle, a part of you starts to feel trapped within its walls, if that makes sense. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I went on a date last night, the night before recording this. It's the first time I've been on a date in a while, and it was with a girl who I've been interested in for some time. And I had no idea if she liked me at all, which is why it was really scary. But last night she sort of gave me an indication that she might like me, and so on the way home, I was very happy. It gave me this great injection of energy. But when I got home, for some reason, I also had this strange pang of anxiety sort of shoot into my chest, and I sort of felt like running away. And I didn't know why, and I thought about it, and I realized that I must be experiencing the unbearable lightness of being. If you are unwilling to make sacrifices in life, then you are completely free, but you're also kind of like a directionless cloud of smoke. Maybe the smoke billowing from the burning heart of a dying storm god. But if you want something to mean something, you have to tie yourself down to another person or a creative pursuit or your faith or whatever. But in doing so, you also give up your ability to make other choices. I miss my family so much this time of year. They're so far away, and I really wish I could be with them, but I also know that if I were with them, I would be longing for and missing my friends and my life here in Japan. Because they both matter, I know that I'm never going to get to have both, and it's this fucked up part of being a human being where we don't seem to be built for contentment or satisfaction. We're always just looking for the hidden potential in all the things that we imagine we lack. And when I was recording this podcast, it made me think about the lives that we lead as the sum total of the sacrifices that we are willing to make, because whenever we make a choice, if it matters, we're also choosing to give the other thing up, and it's almost like our lives are the sum of the energy that is being shot into our lives because of all the things that we were willing to sacrifice, to not choose. And even though that's a horrible message to tie this whole thing up with, I at least hope we can share in each other's confusion. I do think that life is very painful and very difficult for most people, but we do seem to have, I do believe that, this magical ability to ease the suffering of others. And that's something. And I just want to say that one sacrifice that I've made this week is I've given up some of my time and some of my energy and, as you can probably tell, my ability to speak, to bring you guys another episode of this podcast. But you also need to know that it's a sacrifice that I make so fucking willingly, and if it was easy for me to do, I would tear the heart out of my own chest and give it to you on a silver platter. That's how grateful I am to the people who come and listen to this podcast. I'm on another podcast now with like famous people, and I'm making all these videos, and that's very fun, but these are the projects that I really care about, and the listeners who come here are the ones I really care about. And I'm sorry that this relationship is so very one-sided. Please let me know what's going on with you in the comments. I do read all of them, and if this is a difficult and a dark time for you, then I hope I was able to provide maybe a little bit of light, or at least a little bit of entertainment. For now, I'm going to try and get some sleep. That's probably not going to go too well. As you can tell, I'm thinking about way too many things right now, but I'll do my best. Wish me luck. I love you guys very much. I'll see you very soon.